suspects are being. One case involves the FBI is now offering $100,000 to see if the police are releasing.
Welcome to Misty Mysteries. I'm your host Keely, and this is a paranormal and true crime podcast. Today's episode is the first part in a two-parter. It's one of those topics where I begin with a true crime case or history of the place, and we'll talk about the haunting of it in part 2. This place, of course, is the famous Bobby Mackey's Music World in Wilder, Kentucky. But I want to focus on the victims of the crimes in this bar or related to it first. In particular, a young woman named Pearl Bryan, who I feel her story gets so blended into the bar, which feels a little unfair to me, that many years later her story is just filled with rumors and false facts. I do want to warn you before listening further that this episode will heavily talk on pregnancy, miscarriages, abortions, and violence. So, who exactly is Pearl Bryan? She was born on October 25th, 1872, to parents Alexander and Susan Bryan. Pearl was born in Greencastle, Indiana, as the youngest child out of 12. But when she was born, only 6 of her siblings were living. Her father was a very successful dairy operator and breeder who offered his children a life in elite communities. Pearl was seen as a beautiful and popular woman. She worked as a Sunday school teacher after graduating from Greencastle High School in 1892, and on her time off, she spent time with her many friends. One of these friends, and what seems to be her closest, was her second cousin, William Wood. In spring of 1895, when Pearl was 23 and William was 20, he introduced Pearl to his friend, 27-year-old Scott Jackson. William met Scott while Scott was visiting his family in Greencastle, and after spending some time together, William decided to introduce Pearl and Scott. Everyone felt like Scott was the perfect suitor for her, but what they didn't know is that Scott had a history of crime. While working on the railroad, Scott got in trouble for fraud and had 2 disorderly conducts with sex workers. Scott and Pearl spent a short time dating before he left to attend school at the Ohio College for Dental Surgery in Cincinnati, Ohio. And before leaving for school, it's believed that Scott made it clear to Pearl he did not want to marry her, but one big issue arose. Pearl found out she was pregnant. Pearl confided in William about the pregnancy, and he began to exchange letters with Scott about how Pearl could induce a miscarriage. During this time in the United States, laws around abortion were different than they are in many states today. Although some states have been pushing to go back to these laws, the laws at the time restricted abortions in every state, with the exception of when a team of doctors felt termination of the pregnancy was medically or therapeutically necessary to save the life of the woman who was pregnant. Criminalization had also started around this time, meaning that if a woman who was pregnant came into the hospital miscarrying or suffering from what looked like a botched abortion, that woman could be arrested or charged with a crime. And at this time, it was also looked down on to become pregnant outside of marriage, meaning that many who became pregnant but didn't want to marry were either left marrying someone that they did not want to or suffering from at-home abortions. Unfortunately, the law and how women in general were treated unwed or wed left many seeking ways to terminate their pregnancies without harm to themselves or being caught by law enforcement. One of these women was Pearl, and we don't know if this is true, but it's believed she tried the many ways Scott and William suggested to induce a miscarriage, but with no success. Pearl is still pregnant and now 5 months long, around 18 to 22 weeks. Pearl took a train ride on January 28, 1896. She told her parents she was going to be visiting a family friend named Miss Fisher in Indianapolis, but instead she headed to Cincinnati where she checked into room 114 at a hotel named the Indiana House to meet with Scott. On her first night at the hotel, Scott could not meet up with her and instead called her the next day before she left the hotel to meet up with Scott and his roommate at the dental school named Alonzo Walling. Unfortunately, at the time of meeting with Pearl, Scott did not have the best of intentions. Drinking buddies of Scott at the dental college shared that they had heard Scott talk about Pearl while drinking with him. They said that Scott talked about Pearl being pregnant and the many ways he could get rid of her and the baby. The first being that he could force feed her drugs, making her death look like a suicide, and if that failed, he could kill Pearl and hide her body. Sadly, his and Alonzo's actual meeting with Pearl did not go much different than his drinking buddy said he talked about. On February 1st, 1896, a man named either John B. Locke or John Holing, depending on the report, was walking on his land in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, when he found the body of a woman who had been decapitated. This man immediately got the police involved, and the police made a very gruesome and horrible discovery. After bringing a blood splatter analysis technician to the scene of the crime, they found that the woman had been decapitated while she was still alive, based on how her blood had pooled. It was determined her blood was still pumping through her body. Sadly, whoever had done this to her had taken her head with them, and without DNA or many forensic advancements we have today, the police could not figure out who the woman was, believing that she was most likely a sex worker. The woman was taken to a nearby funeral home where an autopsy was done confirming that she was 5 months pregnant, cocaine was present in her system when she passed away, and that whoever had decapitated her did it with a dissecting knife due to how clean the wound looked. In hopes to figure out who this woman was, the police first questioned nearby brothels to see if any of their employees were missing, and then sent out bloodhounds with the scent of the woman to see if they could find her head or anything that may belong to her. But with no hits from the bloodhounds, they looked into her clothes, which was a blue dress, and her shoes, which were green high-heeled boots with yellow bottoms. The woman's shoes seemed very familiar to a Newport shoe store owner named Lewis Pock, who owned a store named Lewis and Hayes just a few buildings away from the funeral home where the woman had been sent to. The news of the woman's death had traveled, and many people were fascinated by her death. At the time, people were going to the crime scene, taking pictures, and even taking keepsakes such as branches and buckets of dirt that still had her blood in it. Others would stand outside the funeral home, hoping they could gain access to see her body, even with police blocking the doors to keep them out. But Lewis was friends with some of the police who let him in to see her body. When Lewis was looking at the woman, he noticed that she had very small feet, and her shoes looked very expensive. He also noticed a unique code on the bottom of her shoe, and with permission, he did his own investigation on her shoes. He was able to find out where the shoes were made and find out that they were sold to Pearl Bryan. And on February 6, 1896, 5 days after the woman had been found on the farm in Fort Thomas, the police took her clothes to the home of Pearl Bryan, where her mother was able to identify that the woman who had been killed was her daughter, Pearl Bryan. Very quickly, and with the help of William, police were able to connect Scott and his roommate Alonzo to the death of Pearl and arrested the two at their boarding home. I want to note that the letters her cousin William wrote to Scott did end up incriminating William. He was arrested and charged as an accomplice in Pearl's murder, and rumors even spread that he was the father of Pearl's baby, although he denied this and it was never able to be proven. William was able to get the charges dropped by agreeing to testify against both Scott and Alonzo when they went to trial. And then when it came to Alonzo and Scott, they never really worked with the police. At first, Alonzo told police it was Scott's idea to decapitate Pearl, and he claimed that he had no idea where her head was, saying that Scott took her head, saying that he had better uses for it, although Alonzo states he never knew what that meant, and that Scott probably threw Pearl's head in the Ohio River. By mid-February, Pearl's family was ready to lay her to rest. Her father, mother, sister Mabel, and brother Fred traveled to Kentucky to take Pearl to a funeral home in Cincinnati in order to prepare her to be brought home to Greencastle for her funeral and to be laid to rest. Police at this point started to panic because they wanted to find Pearl's head so that she could have a proper and full burial, and they only had a short time before her funeral. The police really pressed Scott and Alonzo for any information in hopes that they would find her head, but the men refused to give any helpful information to the police. Sadly, by the time her funeral came, her head was still missing, and the police came up with this idea that if the men attended her funeral, the men could see her family hurting and see what they had done to Pearl, and that they would give the location of her head. In an old newspaper article, I was able to find the men's reactions while at her funeral. Scott was described as being terribly excited. He was nervous, messing around with his hands. He was rolling his eyes and shaking his head and letting out deep sighs. He looked like he was ready to break down. Alonzo, on the other hand, was described as being the coolest man in the room. He looked at Pearl without any guilt or fear. He looked at everyone in the room and seemed very agitated. He was tapping his foot on the floor, and Mabel even had a conversation with Scott that day, begging him to tell them what they knew. The conversation started by Mabel asking Scott, "I ask you, Scott Jackson, to tell me what you have done with poor Pearl's head," and Scott didn't answer her. She continued saying, "For the love of heaven, tell me what you have done with poor baby's head. Think of her mother, if nothing else. I want to tell her where her baby's head is." Scott told Mabel, "I can't tell you anything about it." Scott and Alonzo never told the truth about what they did to Pearl or where her head is, but before they went to trial in the early months of 1897, on March 18th, Scott and Alonzo were put together in a room with pencil and paper and left to write their confession. What the two men wrote in their separate confessions told pretty much the same story. Pearl went to Cincinnati to have an abortion. Alonzo asked his girlfriend at the time, Mae Smith, for the name of an abortionist, which she gave him the name Dr. George Wagner in Bellevue, Kentucky. The men connected to the doctor, and arrangements were made for Pearl to see the doctor. On Wednesday, the day that Pearl arrived, Alonzo met up with her to give her directions to the doctor's home, and she went to the home by herself. On Thursday, Scott and Alonzo met up with Pearl at the doctor's home to deliver her valise, which is a small suitcase or travel bag, and the three left the doctor's home. On Friday, all three went back to the doctor's home for the abortion, but Pearl had complications very early on and was in a lot of pain. The doctor sent Scott to Fort Myer drugstore to get ergot, a fungus used to ease pain, but the ergot had no effect on Pearl. The doctor then injected Pearl with an unknown clear liquid and gave her whiskey to drink. Pearl had a reaction to whatever was given to her and she became unconscious. A few minutes later, he pronounced her dead, and the men decided to load Pearl into a car where they took her to the secluded spot on the farm in Fort Thomas. Once at the spot, the doctor severed Pearl's head with a dissecting knife. When he was done, he wrapped it up in a cloak and drove Scott and Alonzo to the bridge in Cincinnati, where they all separated. After this confession, the police spoke to Dr. George Wagner, who denied knowing these men, Pearl, or even having any information about abortions being done in his home. Scott and Alonzo's confessions were not seen as very reliable, and a different story was formed. This story has changed a lot over time, but I used newspapers from the time that the crime happened to get the most accurate of what they believed happened to Pearl. Going back to January 28, 1896, when Pearl checked into the Indiana hotel, and the first day she had no contact with Scott or Alonzo. It wasn't until the next day, after they took the time to call Pearl, she met the men at a tavern. It's not known if she knew she was meeting with Scott to have an abortion, or if she thought she was meeting with him to marry him, but the worker at the tavern saw Scott put something in her drink, while Pearl was not looking. He most likely put medical cocaine in her drink that was found in her system, and the police knew he had it on him since a chemist confirmed just days before he had sold medical cocaine to Scott, not knowing what it was for, but cocaine at the time was a common medicine, and it was just like walking into the pharmacy and asking for ibuprofen or Tylenol. And when the cocaine did not work on Pearl, Scott and Alonzo attempted to give Pearl an abortion with dental tools they had brought with them, but Pearl began to bleed out from this botched abortion attempt. And this is when the men made the decision to hire a driver to take them to northern Kentucky. The driver's name was George Jackson, and George had no idea what was going on with Pearl and the men. But during the around 20-minute drive, Pearl began to moan in pain. George was terrified of what was happening to Pearl. He wanted to stop driving, but Alonzo threatened to hurt him if he stopped driving. When the four of them made it to a secluded section of the farm in Fort Thomas, George ran away as Alonzo and Scott dragged Pearl away from the car. The men then decapitated Pearl, and from what Alonzo had told police, Scott took Pearl's head with him, and this is when Scott put Pearl's head in her own valise. And this is believed because her hair and her blood was later found in that valise. And when police asked Scott about the valise, Scott said if her hair and her blood is in it, then her head must have been. Scott, with Pearl's head in the valise, then got a drink at the bar near his college, where a bartender noticed that his bag had a weird shape, asking if he had a bowling ball in the bag since it was so round and heavy. Scott then left, and when he came back, the bag's round shape was gone. This is when the story gets very mixed up. So I first want to say that Pearl's head was sadly never found, but she was laid to rest in her family plot in the Forest Hill Cemetery. People to this day leave pennies on her grave, always heads up, and unfortunately some will even pick out her gravestone to take it home, and when her family was still alive, it made her family have to replace her gravestone. Scott and Alonzo went to trial in early 1897, as mentioned earlier. And this trial was filled with people trying to get into the courthouse to watch and see the men who killed Pearl, some even wanting to hurt the men for themselves. And in another unfortunate situation, kind of like her gravestone and the keepsakes from her crime scene, merchandise of Pearl's murder was sold outside of the courthouse. But Scott and Alonzo were found guilty of Pearl's murder and sentenced to be executed not too long after their trial. On March 20th, 1897, both of the men were sent to the gallows behind the courthouse. Their execution was actually the last public execution in Campbell County, Kentucky, and their deaths left a terrifying sight for those who attended it, because the men's necks did not break right away, and it took them minutes to basically suffocate. Alonzo on the gallows swore he was innocent, but despite very popular theories, Scott never really spoke, and he definitely did not curse everybody or talk about the devil on the gallows, at least from what I could find in news reports. Now, going back to Pearl's head, this is when a lot of rumors and misinformation come in. Historians very strongly believe that Scott, on the night of her murders, took her head from the bar to his college, where he used the cremation furnaces to cremate her head. At this time, dental colleges used cadavers to practice dental procedures, and the students were taught how to cremate the cadavers, which is why Scott would have access and knowledge on how to do such a thing. Then we have the popular and the most well-known theory that even I believed till learning more about Pearl's life and death, which is an occult connection. In 2001, a book was written about the ghost stories of the country music bar Bobby Mackey's Music World. This book tells the story of Pearl and Scott, but in the story, Scott used to go to the slaughterhouse in Wilder, Kentucky, where he performed satanic rituals on dead animals. On the night he murdered Pearl with Alonzo, he brought her head back to the slaughterhouse to perform a ritual, where he then threw her head in the well where they used to throw away animal blood. The slaughterhouse is now Bobby Mackey's Music World. And until learning more about Pearl, I used to think this theory was exactly what happened to her. I used to think that her head was found in that well. What exactly happened with Pearl was tragic, and her story was a very hard one for me to tell. But I want to take the time and talk about other crimes we know took place at Bobby Mackey's before it was Bobby Mackey's. The first, and probably one of the most popular, involves a woman named Johanna that Bobby Mackey actually wrote a song about. Johanna worked at the bar when it was an illegal casino with fine dining and dancing. She fell in love with a man who she worked with named Robert Randall. As the relationship progressed, Johanna became pregnant, but her father, who had connections to organized crime, did not like this, and he had Robert killed. Johanna, heartbroken about the death of her lover, poisoned her father, and then went back to the bar where she poisoned herself in, I believe, the attic, where she left a poem written on the wall before she died by suicide. The poem for a long time, and I believe maybe even currently, could still be seen written on the wall, and it reads, "My love is deep as the sea that flows forever, you and me. Wherever it ends, I tell you never. My love is as bright as the sun that shines forever. You ask me when will it end, I tell you never. The world may disappear like a castle of sand, but I will be waiting here with my heart in my hand. My love, I love you so much, now and forever. You ask me when will it end, I tell you never." Bobby Mackey's changed many hands and names throughout time, and the bar saw many shootings and attacks and fights throughout history, most of which I couldn't find names for these victims, and it is because most fully recovered. But as we know, I do believe violence, even if it doesn't end in death, will mark a place. For now, this concludes part 1 of Bobby Mackey's two-parter. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next week when I talk about the pretty intense and insane hauntings that take place in the Bobby Mackey music world. Please stay safe, stay hydrated, and I will see you next week.